Welcome, welcome. I'm happy to welcome everyone to this special book study. And we're going to discuss a very special book tonight. And I hope you will enjoy it. And I hope you have many questions and many nice subjects and topics to talk about and enrich our discussion. And before we start, we're going to have a prayer, and we are going to be this study is going to be coordinated by Dr. Mueller. Dr. Eike Mueller is an associate professor here at the seminary in AIIAS, and he's also the assistant dean of the seminary. So welcome everyone. And the book is a very interesting book. It talks very much to us as Seventh-day Adventists. And the title of the book is Jesus and the Forces of Death. Amazing and interesting topics of discussion on purity and impurity. So let's have a word of prayer and let's start. And the author is going to be introduced by Dr. Mueller. He's going to give us a feedback on the author and the motivation to write this book. Let's pray together. Thank you, Father, for again bring us together tonight to have this moment to enrich our knowledge of your word, of Jesus Christ, our Savior, as the one who changed the whole world and the one who also fulfill all the prophecies. Soon he comes and purify this word and purify all of us and makes us whole and gives us eternal life. Thank you, Lord, for all the promises you have given to us, and thank you for your love to us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Dr. Mueller, thank you.
Hello, and welcome to everybody that is joining us live, and those of you that will join by looking and watching this later on. I hope you enjoy this as well. So welcome to you. For those of you that are live, before we actually get into our discussion of the topic tonight, I already want to make an advertisement for our next session that we're going to have next month. So we try to have a colloquium for you every single month. You remember by now probably the order that we usually do this. It starts off with, first of all, a faculty lecture, and then we usually have a guest lecture, and then finally a book discussion, a book review. So today is the session for the book review, as Dr. Cruz has already introduced you to, Matthew Thiessen's Jesus and the Forces of Death. Next time, we're going to have not a faculty lecture, that was a couple of weeks ago. Instead, we're going to have a guest lecturer, and that guest lecturer is Dr. Gordon Beets, and the title is Servant Leadership. And let me just give you just a moment of why we invited him to join us for a special session. The reason is, a few months ago, we actually had a very interesting and lively discussion amongst our live audience here on the topic of leadership. And we had the book review discussion on biblical leadership. Some of you might remember that, and I actually am still enjoying some chapters. You remember that we had the book discussion on this book. And so because there was such a great interest, we said we'll focus a little bit on leadership from different angles. So the previous meeting was about leadership as well, from a reading of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, including a little bit of Freud as well. And the next one is going to be on leadership as well, a guest professor. Dr. Gordon Beets was the president of Southern Adventist University when I was a student there. And so I asked him if he would be willing to join us for this meeting. He is both a pastor at heart and a long-term administrator. And actually at the moment, he heads, while in retirement, he's kind of in charge of coordinating between all the universities in the North American division, which is quite a number of universities in our Adventist educational network. And so he has lots of experience in a variety of capacities, and he will be joining us next time. So be sure not to miss out on that special guest lecture coming live. Come prepared with your questions. Dr. Beetz specifically said that he wanted to have a lot of questions and wanted to do it live, not just pre-recorded. I gave him the choice to pre-record it. That's more flexible with the different time zones. And he said he'd rather join us very early in the morning so that he can be live and answer any questions we have. Invite your friends. That's going to be a very special meeting, and I look forward to that. Okay, that was a bit of advertisement for our next meeting. And now we come to today's session. This is the book that we're going to be focusing on and looking at. And I invite you to join. This is a participatory event, not a monologue. So I'm glad that we have a couple of you here. And hopefully you've had enough time to read bits of it or all of it along the way. This is a very interesting book that has caused quite a bit of stir. It came out 2020, so it's a year and a half old approximately, and it was the cause even of an entire session at the SBL meetings, an entire session dedicated to the discussion of it because of its quite radical for scholarship ideas and treatment. I've been trying to get a hold of this book for a long time. Let me just tell you my journey of this. I said I want to get this as early as it came out, but because of the pandemic, it wasn't possible. Nobody was at first in the shipping departments, and then the shipping channels, it wasn't possible to get it into the Philippines. So at the last SBL session that I attended last fall, I said, I need to get a hold of this. I went to the booth early on, and all of the books, except for the display copy, had been grabbed and taken, and people had bought it. So I said, can I have the display copy? And they said, yes, indeed. Come on the last day, and you will get a display copy. So on the very last day, after my own presentation, I went to pick up my copy that I had reserved. And lo and behold, it was gone. And in fact, the stock at the store was so depleted that they couldn't even ship it to the United States while I was still there. In fact, it then needed to be expedited to Europe, where I was spending the winter months, the Christmas vacation. And even that was problematic because of tax regulations. The tax office, customs wanted to be paid royally for this book. So that was a long story, months and months and even years of waiting. So I'm excited to have received this copy finally. Many of you have probably read it online, and that's just as good. But I like marking up my book, and this one is heavily marked up. So Matthew Thiessen is an associate professor at McMaster University in Canada, and he has written this volume on purity and impurity, and particularly how Jesus relates to the forces of death. And I don't want to actually give away much more. The rest, I think, will come as we dive into the book and discuss the book. And so make sure that you have your copy ready and share what you have found and what you found interesting. So maybe we usually start off with this idea of easy going into the topic, meaning we ask about style and how does the author write, and maybe we can just briefly touch on it because I think the weight and the interest is in the content of the book. So maybe the first question, those of you that have read it, what kind of style does the author use? How does what have you learned from good behavior of writing, or maybe even some things that you say, well, that didn't work too well for me, and how the argument is laid out. Let's not talk about the argument yet. We'll do that in just a second, but just the style of writing. So I'll just open that up and allow anybody turn on your mics and join me in a book discussion, not just a book monologue. What kind of style and what are things that worked for you as you were looking and reading through sections or the entire book?
Yeah, Dr. Mueller, I can say that he is very much descriptive. You know, he touches subjects that people are not very aware in the time of Jesus Christ. And in fact, you know, I really appreciate what he did, because this helps us in our, you know, as Adventists, although he's not an Adventist in many ways. But I think he's more descriptive than persuasive. You know, he doesn't give exactly a position of many things. He just pours that there, and then he declares that Jesus, in fact, dealt with the impurity in a very special way.
A descriptive approach. I like that. I'll take a note of that, because I want to come back to that. I think you've kind of pointed out an important aspect of that. Excellent. Thank you. Some of you others, what has your experience been in reading this? What style does he use, or what has worked for you as you were reading it?
Yes, thank you. As Dr. Cruz already picked it up, I think on my side, when I was reading it, I felt like the author had a big courage on diving into a controversial topic, which is really controversial in many aspects. When I look at the topic in my setting, especially in the Pentecostal church, it's really a big issue that he decided to dive in. And as Dr. Cruz has pointed out, he does not show any position in every topic that he discusses. He just leave it out for more questions to come. Yeah.
I got, hello. I got kicked out there. Salud, were you speaking just a second ago? Could you repeat what you were saying, or?
Oh yeah, that was Jean-Claude. Oh, it's gone again.
Hello? Hello, Prof?
I think he's offline. Well, we can continue. Well, let's wait, because he's guiding the discussion. But I'm not sure if it's our connection here or your connection, Jean-Claude. But we had a moment of a pause here.
Oh.
Yeah, you know, I believe.
Try this again.
As Dr. Mueller. Good.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Sorry, did I interrupt you? You go ahead. I think I'm coming in and out.
Yeah, we're
Go
just
ahead.
filling the gaps. Go ahead.
I think I missed what was happening because I got thrown out of the internet. I don't know if it was unstable for you, but can we just have the last? Can I catch up on what was just happening? Can you share with me?
Yeah, Jean-Claude, go ahead. Just complete what you're saying.
Oh, thank you so much. I was saying that I could not agree more with what Dr. Cruz has said already. He is in somehow descriptive. And I was saying that he's at many points, he's very courageous because the topic is really controversial in many aspects which are theological. So the aspect of being descriptive, not taking a position in everything that he was explaining was very catchy for me.
Hello.
Okay, thank you for sharing that.
Good. Good evening.
Yes. Cello, how are you? Well, what did you think about the style book? Thank you, Jean-Claude. Cello, what do you think? Share with us.
Prof, I'm good. I thank God. Yes, the book is descriptive, but I see him at some point a little argumentative. You see that he's writing on a topic that seems strange. Many volumes have gone out in the something brain. So this time he goes back to those volumes, bring up the ideas, and knock it out.
Okay, it seems he's out again. Yes, as you are saying, Pastor Selu, it seems there was, he did some argument, all right, in favor of some position and sides. Can you continue what you're saying?
Yes, I'm saying his Matthew's book is very descriptive, but at the same time, there is some aspect of argument. He's coming from an angle that looks strange in modern scholarship. So he looks at what have been said earlier about ritual purity and moral purity, and what the trend of understanding has been. Sometimes he goes back for it, bring it out, and try to trash it out, giving it a different meaning altogether.
Yeah, of course. He has some apologetics in favor of some positions, but not very. I think it's not the goal. No, I think that's my view. It's not his goal to defend a position, especially because he's dealing with some ethical issues and practices and cultural aspects of Judaism in the first century. Okay, Dr. Mueller, you're back. Okay.
I'm I'm in and out. I'm like in a coma. I come in and I go out.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll keep on doing that till we kind of till the internet is better. I don't know. Okay, so I heard argumentative and descriptive as two styles. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. That's what Selou just said. Now that there are some arguments, but not the whole book is dedicating to argue in favor of a position.
Indeed, I think.
Yes.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's what Selou has just said. Although it's descriptive, there's a lot of arguments in favor of different issues and things that are not even known to us today. You know, we're going to go into that as you go and guide our discussion. But in fact, he is very concise. You know, he could have taken more pages and time to describe more things. The Jewish culture is so rich, and I think he didn't really go deep into that. Even, for example, part of one of the discussion that calls my attention on the diet, he makes it as an appendix. So it's really descriptive, you know. An appendix is just description. So he doesn't want to go into points that could divide his readers.
Very good. So I think that it's correct. There are multiple approaches to it. Just in terms of style, and something that I want to recommend to you that are learning to write, or that that are learning the skill, that are preparing for a thesis or a dissertation, I really like what he does. In every chapter, he has a certain pattern that he repeats. And after you read one chapter and a second chapter, you kind of see the pattern. The first is he has an introduction to the chapter or to the concept. Then he goes into old views, ancient Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia. Then he goes into Second Temple period arguments, and then he goes into the New Testament. And then he does an interesting summary where he summarizes everything and illustrates how it fits into the pattern of his whole work. And I think this is an important thing, to always let your reader know where you are in an argument. I'm going to make this point, and it's going to contribute in this way to my big picture. So I find that a very helpful style, especially with very complex topics. And so that's something that I want to recommend to you that are writing. Know exactly where you are in the argument. And then you don't even have to be incredibly explicit. It's a pattern that you notice as you read along. And then always find a good way of summarizing. Where does what you've just discussed, how does that help you solidify your argument? So I found that to be a very helpful style. And in some ways, that might be what you're saying is descriptive. It describes this process of unearthing and uncovering something. So I found that to be a very good and helpful style that he was using as a big layout and kind of as an overall structure. So take that as good writing style, those of you that are looking to write. I think another thing, as you've already mentioned, is precision. There's no superfluous arguments. There's no going back to Adam and Eve, I sometimes say. Keep to the argument, be precise, talk about what's relevant. He doesn't parse every single word. He only talks about the words that are important. He doesn't give you a morphology of the words. That's not important. He's talking about the concept. So that precision, and some of you have heard me say that a good argument is like an arrow. If you want to hunt a gazelle, you don't just take a whole tree and try to knock it out. Uproot a tree and try to knock out a gazelle. You're not going to get anywhere. You have to take the tree and reduce it until it's as thin and narrow as a arrow. Then you can fire it, and then it'll travel the distance. Only if it's that light, almost invisible. And that is a good argument, not a tree trunk. Don't kill people with a tree. You catch a gazelle with an arrow. The hardest part of research is reducing, not adding. Everybody can add, but reducing down to the minimum your argument so that it is a clear and concise. Everything that needs to be there is there, but nothing that doesn't need to be there has been left either. So I think he's done an excellent job in that. So that was about style. Now the interesting part is the content, right? So this was kind of the warm-up. Now let's talk about the argument. And so how would you summarize the argument? How would you say this is what he's trying to say in this book? Share with me what you would say is the synthesis of what he's trying to say.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Go ahead. I can hear you.
Okay, good. Okay. Thiessen tries to argue that throughout this book, Jesus Christ, he did not oppose the ritual purity, but he sought, or he tries to overcome that the powers associated with impurity. That what the author tries to argue throughout his book. Jesus, he did not oppose the ritual purity, but he tries to overcome those of impurity.
Okay, thank you. I think you've got some of the main points. Some others, how did you see the main point? How would you argue his main point? You have a different perspective. That's maybe what I should ask.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Hello.
Yes, I see him as discussing the Jesus portrayed in the gospel that he referred to as the canonical Jesus, as a Jew in the true sense of the word when it comes to ritual and moral purity.
Okay. He's emphasizing Jesus's location in the Jewish context. Okay, good.
Context, yes, that he was purely a Jew because he did not rule out the ritual purity and impurity practices while he was alive. At least the Jesus portrayed in the gospel is one that conformed and complied to it, did not rule them out, nor did he throw it out. So he was a Jew in the true sense of the word, unlike what others have portrayed him to be.
Okay, I think that's an excellent contribution. Thank you, Salu. Any other summary?
Yes.
Joy.
For me, what
Dr.
impacted
Cruz.
more is that he gives emphasis that the laws of health are still relevant today. And I feel really happy for that, because I'm in favor of keeping these principles and preaching and sharing with others. So I wonder here now, I see someone who is not a Jew, who's not a Seventh-day Adventist, talking about the purity. As I said, he's not argumentative, but he describes it and he gives light to many aspects of how we should understand it.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure he would clarify that as health laws. He would say it's purity laws, but he might disagree with you on the nomenclature. But I think on the content we can agree. Yes. Good.
Okay.
Well,
me.
okay.
Okay, go ahead. You can go ahead, Pastor Jean-Claude.
Daniel, is that you?
Yes, Pastor. Yeah. Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes,
How
for
did you
me,
see it?
Pastor, yeah, I observed that the author intend to show he's not against the Jewish ritual purity, but I think there is a restoration in the miracles and also in the healing accounts. He want to figure out a restoration of purity, yeah, for this people.
Okay. Okay, restoration. I think that's an important topic. I think with that, you're balancing out and adding to what Selu said. So thank you for adding that concept, restoration. Let me give you my summary and you tell me, or Jean-Claude, did you want to say something? You were unmuted. Maybe you wanted to share your summary.
I was just going to give my side. Yeah, from the introduction, the author presents an issue that most of the preachers and scholars are guilty of, and that's what he's dealing in the whole book. I did not have the chance of reading the whole book. I picked some of the chapters that I want to read more, but it's clear that the author is showing that Jesus did not come to build a new religion, but he was part of the Jewish big spectrum in which he did not want to go outside. He did not even go either outside, but he was in that that circle, and that's what the author is showing on my side.
Okay, yes, he's very closely attached to that, and maybe even one additional argument I think that he repeats over and over. Maybe that's not the major, but one of the minor things. All the New Testament writers, this in the synoptics particularly, that's where he's emphasizing, right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke, though he does include John from time to time, but he doesn't go to Pauline literature or the general epistles or the book of Revelation. But in the synoptics, particularly, he would argue that the gospel writers are very precise in their use of ritual language. So Jesus precisely adhered to it, but not only did Jesus adhere to ritual purity and did not challenge the ritual purity system, but also the writers of the New Testament are actually precise, contrary to what has been said many times before, that they just don't know what they're doing. Actually, he counters that and says they know very specifically and are very accurate in their portrayal. So that's just adding to. So thank you, Jean-Claude. Yes, good point. One thing that if I were to summarize this, maybe I would say the following. Jesus is not a priest, but a prophet, and he's more than the prophet. So maybe that would be the summary that I would give. Jesus is more than a prophet. And that might be kind of giving also a Jesus-focused response to it, not just a law or purity-related, ritual-related answer. So let's unpack your thoughts and my thoughts a bit by looking at, this is, we said, the summary statement. How does he get there? What is his line of argumentation? What are his main points? How does he argue his case? How does he build the argument? Share with me what you kind of still in the summary mode before we go to the evaluation of that, whether that works or not, whether you agree or not. Well, Dr. Cruz, you've already said you agree, so you've already evaluated, but,
well, yeah,
but maybe the argumentation, how does he argue his case?
Yeah, in the introduction, he is very clear to say that he's not going to argue about the authenticity of where he found the information. But he says, I'm going just to describe what the writers about Jesus are really speaking about Jesus, what they want to mean when they talk about Jesus and everything that they describe in the Gospels and the other sources that, you know, he went in many different sources to find information, not only the Gospel, but he went into the Josephus and the other literature to find information. So he's not very concerned about the veracity of those texts, but how people are perceiving Jesus in this literature. So this gives opportunity or gives a door to many different interpretations from his writings. In fact, you know, this type of book, it's a book written for, I would say, a descriptive book that is very interesting and brings new ideas and new knowledge about something that many people have studied a lot, makes a book to become very special and everyone wants to have it and read it. So I wouldn't say he has any intention to sell it out or no kind of business, but I would say he could maybe write, here I'm criticized already, I shouldn't do it now, but I think that he would be more efficient in his writing if he could write an appendix or maybe a second volume where he simply argues in favor of what Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Can you hear me? Oh, yes. Is
Yes.
my microphone working? Oh,
Yes.
okay, good, good.
Yes, I can hear you.
So as I was saying, in his introduction, it's very clear to say that this book is not about the historical Jesus. So already we see here, he doesn't want to argue or to combat or, you know, go against anybody else, but he wants to identify how people interpreted Jesus related to death, purity, and impurity rituals. Yes, so, which he does very well, right? And and the sources he uses, the four Gospels, the Josephus, the Gospels that did not make into the New Testament. In other words, he goes broad, right, into this information that he's looking for. And which he does very well, but not as I said, without arguing against any position or any interpretation that makes Jesus a non-historical or historical personality.
Okay. It sounded like you went into the, I'm back from a comatose state, I think. So that was your evaluative judgment already. Is that correct? You're evaluating the strength of the argument.
Yes.
Okay. As we kind of consider, maybe we step back, go back one step. What are some of the arguments that he makes to get to his point? How does he construct the argument to build this case?
Hello?
Yes. Go ahead.
Yes. In his introduction, he clearly stated the reason behind his book, that most times we misconstrue the gospel writer this depiction of Jesus, because we kind of transposed him into our own world. So I see him building his argument by trying to situate the gospel writers and the things that they reported about Jesus within their world. So he focused more on the world of the author, the world behind the text. He dwelled more in that, in trying to make his point, and that's what he started his chapter 1 with. We noticed in his chapter 1 he spent some time on mapping the world within which Jesus functioned, and trying to get his readers into that world so that they will kind of appreciate the point he's making with the gospel writer's view of Jesus in the foreign chapters. So he started from there, and his chapter 1 becomes very crucial. Once we grab the concept he's putting up there, then the other chapters will follow smoothly, because they are linked directly onto the point he's trying to, the world he's trying to describe in the chapter 1.
Thank you. I think you're making a really important part. One of his arguments is we always read Jesus from our modern perspective, right? Mm-hmm. And we don't situate Jesus in the ancient world. And we might have issues or troubles with purity, and we don't understand what it is. And then we just say it doesn't exist, or it's useless, or it's stupid. And so we just get rid of that whole thing. And scholars have done so for a long time, rather than understanding the intricacies of the ancient world. So that's an important argument that he makes, yes. And he reminds us, I think, over and over and over again, not just in structure, but then also in details, that this is not that exclusive even to the Jewish faith. The ancient Egyptians had very similar concepts of purity. The Babylonians had similar concepts, the Assyrians, the Hittites, all along the Levant area. You have very similar ideas of purity and impurity, actually even going into the 1st century AD or CE, however you want to label it. Even the Greco-Roman world still had many of these concepts of purity. And so it would be a fallacy to just say because we don't like it and because we don't get along with these concepts very much in our modern world, they didn't apply to Jesus, or Jesus found a system to disengage with them. And the argument would be no, Jesus was very engaged in them, and it was a very common way of thinking. So thank you. That's an important argument. Absolutely. Yeah. Other arguments that he makes that are crucial to his development of his idea.
Yes, I think it's another idea that's foundational is the fact that he mentions it. Most Christians do not consider the Old Testament as a source for guidance to live today. You already mentioned it, right? Modern life is completely different. So why should we go to the Old Testament to find guidelines to live a better life today? Although many Christians ignore it, they are reluctant to go back because most of the readings they find there, they cannot, or they don't see ways to harmonize with the New Testament teachings of Jesus Christ. And I think the idea here, Thiessen is trying to make bridges, and we see that these things are still relevant, and we can still see the connections between Old and New Testament. And this, for me, is really, I think, foundational for the whole book.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the Old Testament has relevance. It's not irrelevant, and maybe even more so than just relevant. It is not only relevant to the first century, and therefore it should have some relevance to us. There's even this aspect of there is a comprehensible system of purity rules. It's not just a set of stupid rules that don't make any sense. There's a system behind it and a process behind it that kind of makes sense. So I think that's another aspect, and we need to understand that system rather than just ignore it. Yeah.
And he also argues that because we have not paid too much attention to the culture within which the gospel writers carve their message, we have given some kind of a Christian interpretation to some Jewish practices. For example, like baptism, we have understood it to be something you do for the remission of sin and so on. But to them, in the Jewish context, it was nothing less than ritual bath that they are having. So he is arguing that in the eye of the Jewish watchers, what they saw Jesus going through was more or less a ritual bath. And in chapter 3, leprosy, today our understanding of leprosy is quite strange to the understanding of leprosy then. Then leprosy was more or less any skin disease. Today is not that, it's something different. Today we can equate skin diseases or other skin diseases to leprosy. So when we come to the text with our word in front of us, there is tendency to misconstrue other things.
I think you're making an interesting point. The leprosy argument was very intriguing, right? Because leprosy is not the person that is losing their limbs. Leprosy is the scale skin disease, and it's actually the very opposite. And it isn't until the 8th or 9th century that this mistake of considering lepra and leprosy as the same thing happens and occurs, right? As I was reading that, and of course I'd read it in other works before that, in Milgram and others, I was reminded of how often we get this wrong in our sermons and in our depictions of Jesus ourselves, as he states it and narrates it, right? So very interesting point. Thank you. Other arguments that you noticed in this work?
Yeah, one of the arguments that I noticed, or he like put on a big weight on it, it's when he says that when Jesus was healing the lepers, when he was resurrecting the dead, he was not casting out the Jewish purity concerns or all those traditions, but on contrary, he was restoring their purity, not throwing out or casting out their laws of purity and impurity and holiness and something like that.
Excellent. Yeah. So he's not against the law and he's not against Leviticus, but instead he is offering an alternative, right?
Yes, in line with Pastor Jan, what I saw interesting in his argument around the cleansing of the lepers is that Jesus cleansed the lepers but did not declare them clean. He left that for the duty of the priest. He recognized that he recognized the priestly office for that duty. He cleansed them, but he sent them to go to the priest so that he can declare them clean.
He actually sent them back to the priest to get verified, right? With that giving validity to the ritual purity system that that the Jews had in place. So let's look at the argument just a little bit. He makes several arguments to come to his final conclusion, and he looks at the rituals, including water and how to cleanse yourself. And then he looks at the specific instances, and that is genital discharges and having to do with the flow of blood or the emission for men and women. He looks at those purity regulations and the times that Jesus encounters these people. And he differentiates between normal and abnormal, between the big concepts of purity and impurity on the one side, and holiness and profanity or the profane on the other side, dealing a lot with Leviticus 10. So 10:10, where we have that distinction. Then he talks about the sava, the sav or the sava, the person that has a discharge. And he specifically looks at the example of Mark chapter 5, the woman that has the flow of blood for 12 years. Then he has the instances of death and corpse impurity. And then the third category that he specifically deals with is leprosy and unclean spirits. So these are the four main categories. And in each of these cases, he looks at the historical context and says, generally, most of the cultures agreed to the basic premises, even in terms of time frames, talking about the flow of blood or the actually in case of childbirth, around 40 days in almost all the cultures of the Levant in that region of impurity. And he talks about this concept in each of those cases, making the distinction that impurity is not sin. He has one of the places where he says that maybe more than, I highlighted it here. Let me find that where he really hammers this point. Yeah, if you're wanting to find it quickly, then you don't, right? As quickly as you want to. And I made it so thick and bold, and yet I can't find it quickly. It's not it is not sin. Impurity is not sin. And you have several levels of impurity. So a childbirth, you have 7 days of intense impurity, and then you have another 33 days of relaxed impurity, where you're not allowed to enter into the temple, but you're allowed to do everything else. This first 7 days, you are contagious, so to speak, and then the second phase, you're living at home, but you're not allowed to enter the temple per se. So various levels of impurity. His argument is that the New Testament, Jesus, his family, always kept these regulations. And Jesus always referred back to these, to the ritual system itself. He's not adding sin to himself. He's not, in that sense, unnecessarily defiling himself. But what Jesus does do, he doesn't remove the categories that exist, but he just expels with holiness what is impure. And that's his ultimate argument, right? Following Milgram, his main argument is there are two forces. There's the force of holiness, and there is the force of impurity. And both of these are strong forces. If normally impurity expels holiness, and therefore it's so dangerous that an impure person enter the temple, because that would make the temple profane. But in Jesus's case, his argument is, and I wish he would have made that even stronger than he does. Jesus expels with his holiness the impurity. Jesus is stronger than the forces of impurity. And that's his ultimate point. It's not that Jesus just disregards it. That would be a very weak person. He's actually trying to ultimately demonstrate how much more powerful God is in this picture than we have in the common description. The common description is Jesus doesn't care about impurity and purity. This is a relic of past times. He disregards it. He has a disdain for it. He thinks it's useless. That is what we often make of it. And because it's useless, we don't need to worry about it. But Thiessen's argument is actually much stronger. No, Jesus doesn't think it's irrelevant. He actually thinks it is real, this force of impurity, these acts or these exhibitions of demon possession, impure spirits, as Mark calls them, of death, of transmitting impurity, of impurity in genital flow. These are real things. That's Thiessen's argument. It's just that Jesus is so much stronger than it. He doesn't diminish it, and he doesn't cancel it. He is just a force of holiness that is stronger than any force of impurity. That, I think, is ultimately his main argument. And he argues that there is usually no, one of his main arguments that is very subtle, I think, he repeats, actually there's no provision for somebody to heal the Sava, the person with the flow of blood. The Levitical code only says this is what you do if you're fine, or you check for leprosy, for the scale skin disease, to be more precise. Well, how you get healed, nobody knows. But if it does suddenly disappear, you go to the priest and show yourself, and then you are cleansed. But there's no precedent really, except for the case of Miriam and the case of Naaman. And both are by prophetic intervention. It's not Aaron who prays for Miriam when she receives leprosy. It's Moses, the prophet, not the Aaronite, not the Levite, not the priest. It's the prophet that prays, and God hears the prophet and the Sava is healed. The woman with leprosy, in this case Miriam, or scale skin disease. The same is true of Naaman. It is not the priest, not even the high priest, to which Naaman goes. It is Elisha to which Naaman goes. And that's the prophet. And now Jesus comes and he acts like a superior prophet, right? Not as a priest. And that's why he always sends them to the priest. Jesus doesn't act as a priest in these instances. He sent them back to the religious ritual system. He acts as the one that comes outside of the established system. And he doesn't break it. He keeps it alive. But he is just more powerful than anything else. Does that make sense? It's not an abolishment.
Yes, it does.
It is that Jesus is a force of holiness, stronger than anything else. And I'm going to share with you my favorite quote already, because I think his last paragraph actually summarizes best what this means. On page 185. Simply put, Cello, can you, I think you have some noise there. Can you mute yourself? Awesome, thank you. Okay. Simply put, if the synoptic writers are wrong in their depictions of Jesus, then to follow him would be not only impious, but also suicidal. On the other hand, if they are right, if Jesus is the Holy One of God, this is a term from Mark that John the Baptist used, a force of holiness who destroys the forces of death that give rise to ritual impurity, then to follow him would be to follow in the ways of holiness and life. And I think this is his ultimate argument. Jesus is the Holy One that dispels the forces of death and then subsequently the forces of impurity, because all impurities are extensions that are closer or further removed from death. It all deals with the cycle of death. So that, I think, would be his argument. Do you agree? Do you sense the same thing?
Yes, I agree here. But at the same time, there is a counter argument here, since death is not yet overcome. It's overcome prophetically. You know, we're still dying. People are still dying and suffering. So the promise of the fulfillment of this is in the future, when Jesus will restore the whole world and humankind. So that promise, when Christians do not understand it, they will not embrace the holiness of life and purity of life as a state of a new Christian, a converted individual, living according to God's principles. But yet people will argue, in favor of just ignoring those things and not embracing Jesus, imitating the life of Jesus in purity of life and holiness.
So this is an interesting question, because you're pointing us to the reality of now. And this is probably where the book doesn't give any answers. He stops in a convenient location where there are, he never goes into implications, right? What implications does this have for daily life?
Yeah, that's what
he does an interesting thing about a whole section on situational ethics and how the rabbis, what legal is and conflicts of legality. What if you have two laws that are in opposition to each other, or which we call situational ethics. And he goes into the historic reality of that. But he does not go into the implications for modern life. And you're pointing that out. So we still live in this place between, yes, Jesus, the Holy One, and in him we can have we can overcome, as Revelation would say, in the ultimate sense, at the in the future, but yet we're still limited to the realm here. So how does that impact our life? So that's a very good question that he doesn't answer. So that brings us to the evaluation. What do you see? What does he do well? Where is he missing? What presuppositions does he have? What do you think he leaves out? Where does he overstep things? Evaluate, share with the group here what you think are the strengths and weaknesses of this.
Hello, Prof.
Just to give you a little bit of time to think about it, I'll start sharing.
Hello, Prof.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I think Thiessen succeeds in his purpose of more clearly situating and understanding Jesus within his Jewish context. That was the aim of his book. I think he succeeded. That was the purpose of his book, and I think he did exactly that. He especially did well in frequently reminding the reader to see the biblical text within their own world and not in our 21st century world. He also shows how the Jewish system has been viewed wrongly by modern writers, and he makes a strong argument that Jesus did not intend to oppose it or place himself anti to the Jewish system. It is the book is actually excellent in the use of ancient sources in trying to situate Jesus within the ancient world. He made the ritual concept more understandable to whoever will read his book.
Good, thank you. I think you've pointed out some very important parts, namely, he interacts well with the ancient literature, right? Lots of it, lots of Roman writers, Jewish writers, Philo, Josephus, all the time, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Assyrian sources. So he really dives into the literature there. So thank you, yes. And he achieves his point. Good, good job. Some of you others, what is your evaluation?
Yeah, I could comment some, on chapter 5, when he speaks about Jesus and dead, he doesn't focused in Jesus, but focused in the corpses, in the dead, right? And the rituals of purification and impurity, and also he compares impurity as death. Death and impurity is basically the same thing. So the language is very interesting. In other words, death is the extreme of impurity. When someone's really, there is nothing more impure than being dead. And then he speaks about Jesus as bringing resurrection. When he resurrects, he also brings up other people, and then Lazarus, and but you see, my only thing is that I wish here he could speak a little more about the meaning of death and resurrection, not only related to death, but related to life. You know, what can we expect for life? How can we answer our questions when our friends die, when our family die? You know, are they impure? You know, those questions, existential questions, could be dealt here in this chapter, where, you know, with more focusing more in the fact of Jesus being above death, superior to any challenges, including death.
I hear you're very much an applied theologian.
You know, it's a temptation.
How do we apply this?
Yes, how to apply it. Yeah, you know, he discusses extensively on the corpses and the dead and all the impurity of death. But then what's the opposite of it? Because he talks about this polarity, you know, he calls it two sides, no, two extremes, profane and holy, and impure and pure. So he starts his chapter saying that he's going to discuss this, especially on chapter 1. But in chapter 5, he's more focused on impurity and death. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah. I think that is a valid point, as we noted already. The missing application in some ways. How does that impact human life? I think that's particularly interesting, since this is a book that was published by Baker. It's not a book published by Peter Lang. It's not a book published by Peters or Brill, which are known for extensive argumentation about, you know, very specific things that usually are not related very closely to Christian faith. He is writing that and published this with a publisher that is very interested in Christian living as well, with the whole series. This is supposed to be accessible to people of all levels of engagement, not just the scholarly world, though it is a very scholarly book. And I think in the writing style, he manages to make it both interesting to some extent, but also not so heavy burdened with terminology that you can't follow it if you're not a specialist. It's not full of Latin and Greek. It's readable. And that's actually in the back. It has this compelling and wonderfully written. And I think that is correct. It is a compelling argument and written so that most people can understand it. And yet it does lack that aspect of application. So yes, thank you for sharing that. Yeah. I'll pipe in, but keep on adding to this. I think one thing, and you've already mentioned it earlier, this is in some ways, it reads at times a bit apologetic. And maybe apologetic is actually the wrong thing, because usually you do apologetics for an orthodox position, meaning an established position. Here he's actually arguing a very novel position. So maybe apologetic is not the right word, but I understand what you're trying to say with this, and that is he's quite defensive. And his engagement with scholars, I mean, he does not leave anybody in a good light. I mean, nobody. Even though he might take a wording here and there from an author, he just takes everybody to task. And in some ways, it's a bit refreshing, kind of the hubris of intellectualism. We have all the answers of past generations. Well, this is just that Luke just doesn't know what he's writing about. We know better today. He goes into this whole thing relating to scholars of the mid-50s of the previous century that thought they knew all the answers. And he kind of exposes, he actually goes out of his way to say, it's funny that they argue that Luke only had a word. He does this in the context of the parents, Jesus's parents, and the ritual purity system. And they argue, and he uses their words, Luke only had a understanding based on the words, not on the culture. And he kind of goes out of his way to chastise these authors. You think that you know better than Luke? Like, you're 2,000 years removed. And what else do you have? You only have words. Luke actually had a whole lot more than words. He had eyewitnesses and original people. And so he takes these scholars to task, and in some ways, rightfully so. There is this certain hubris that you can get, this intellectualism that makes you so proud of yourself and your own achievements. And I think he rightfully challenges people and has a good point. And this is something that maybe some of my students remember from classes, if you've had classes from me before. Scholars often have correct observations, and they have a right to ask questions, but very often we find that they don't have the good answers. Yet when people talk about it, they think they have the right answer. If you ask a scholar, I have the answer. There's a certain humility that we all need to learn. And if that's one thing that we can learn from this book, since he takes everybody to task, the brightest scholars in literature, everybody, he just takes everybody to task and says, you're all wrong. And he has a good point. But that should make us all a bit humble in all of our preaching, in all of our pontificating. Let's not be the same. Let's be humble. It's okay to observe things in scripture and to ask questions, but be very careful with answers. Most likely, somebody will come up later and say, you were actually not quite right. Good attempt, but. And so this humility is something that really, and he does it so often that it almost becomes its own trope in the process. That leads me to one criticism, though, as well. He doesn't have any people that he agrees with. He doesn't align himself with people. And there's actually a number of scholars that he could have used to solidify his arguments and strengthen his point of view without having to attack them. There's a whole number of Jewish scholars that have written on this, and modern Jewish scholars, and he doesn't include them. And these would be helpful resources for him that he wouldn't need to criticize. There are other works, dissertations, that he hasn't included in his work that would be very helpful to him. And so he just focuses on the major characters and he takes them down, but he doesn't align himself and find allies in scholarship, because he could have done that as well. So that's a bit of a lacuna. He could have balanced his own position out and actually found compatriots in a number of areas, because he's not the first to say these things, though he makes them very, very clear and precise and adds a lot of first century arguments to it. So that might be a little bit of a lacuna. But maybe you have some of the others. What are some of your evaluation? What are things that he does brilliantly, and what are things that you wish would have been done a little different? Any other comments from our illustrious readers?
You know, there is a point here, and I wonder, I I wonder if he mentioned it anywhere. Maybe my eyes jumped over it, but I don't see any relation that he makes between pure and impure and profane and holy, and how it relates to life, eternal life, and eternal death. In the sense of, when Jesus was saying, and he mentions it in, I like his appendix when he can talk about diet, where he makes a distinction between kosher food and the purification, rituals of food, or the impure food, that Jesus has never denied or rejected those rituals of purification, but he rejects the rituals itself and how they valued it as replacing the love of love. So if impurity springs out of the body, it does not penetrate the body, he says. Nothing suggests that the gospel writers intended to portray Jesus rejecting the Jewish dietary laws. So, in other words, Jesus was confirming all these laws as we understand it, and he could have maybe written maybe a little longer on this, relating this to our understanding of Jesus' salvation on the cross and how he expiate our sins and how he can purify not only inside, when our bodies will be glorified, but also purify our words, since Jesus said that what really destroys man is what comes out of his mouth, right? What comes out of his body. That could be a great way of concluding this book,
Mm-hmm. Hopefully that's a second volume, right? And in fact, there's this whole aspect of what happens afterwards. And maybe he intentionally stopped here because as we look at how purity continues in the New Testament, that is, of course, an interesting discussion. How does the rest of the New Testament depict purity and impurity? And that would answer more of the question that you just raised. So very, very well said, point taken. Maybe I'll add one or two more points. I think we just have to recognize that he comes with a certain set of presuppositions, and I appreciate that he expresses them. Most of them quite clearly at the beginning. He even admits to placing some preference to the far hypothesis, or at least acknowledging the existence of it and kind of allowing that to be, even though he says it's not a major point. So I appreciate him setting out his a priori very clearly at the beginning, but not all of them. And in that sense, we do have to admit that he has a typical view of this process. And that he has a traditional view of the development and the history and the dating of all of these books. That some people might agree or disagree. I don't think it would change his argument, but it's just something to recognize. I think one area that I wish, as Dr. Cruz has mentioned, a section that more clearly specifies how these purity, impurity, holy and unholy, how they relate to each other, and in fact the different levels, and specifying that, outlining the different levels of impurity that he later talks about: first level, second level, third level, what can contaminate, which can't. And the same is true for clean and unclean, because that's another concept which is connected to impurity, but not directly, and there's prohibited and permitted uncleanness, and so on. There's a whole range of subcategories. And on that aspect, he's surprisingly brief and simplistic, while in other aspects, the ancient sources, he is very detailed, often to the point of, yes, I get it, let's just move on. Your point is well taken. So he sometimes goes into too much detail, and on these essential things, at the beginning, it might be helpful to have like a good summary and description of where scholarship already stands, because here he just builds on what already exists. Finally, the largest lacuna, I think, is in dealing more with Jesus. So he talks a lot about the ritual system and that it continues to have relevance, which is a really interesting concept, and he does it well. But there are a lot of interesting questions that scholars have wrestled with, and he doesn't enter into it. How does Jesus do that? So Jesus is the force that is stronger. He's the Holy One. Okay, but to what extent is there precedent to that in the Old Testament? On what basis does Jesus argue that? Does he become unclean, or does he not become unclean in the process of all of this? There's, for example, an interesting idea put out by Roy Gain that has received some traction and is partially considered and sometimes rejected as well, but it's at least a starting point. In Leviticus 11, you have the process of the spring as an eternal source of cleansing. So if you have stale water, like a cistern or something like that, or maybe even a well, certain types of wells, or water in your house that is non-moving, those don't have the same cleansing power as a spring. A spring cannot be contaminated because it's always flowing, and that is called living water. Now, if you just understand how important living water is for the ancient world, and particularly the Levant region, this is hugely important. And the prophetic voice and David find refuge in living water in places where there's a fresh stream. And Jesus, when he talks to the woman at the well in John chapter 4, he uses this imagery of the living water, not the well that is stagnant, but living water, a stream that is always refreshed. And since Leviticus 11 talks about cleansing rituals, it specifies a spring can never be contaminated. It always cleanses everything else. A stream washes away all impurity in its wake. Now, you might still have to wait the time period, but this might be an interesting concept that Jesus actually alludes to in John chapter 3 himself. If we include John into this description, Jesus as the source of that. And so a chapter about Jesus would have been a really interesting, and how Jesus perceives himself would have been a really interesting thing. I know that the conclusion has some of it, but that, I think, is where it could have been strengthened, the whole argument. And more strands and more discussions that have been proposed of how Jesus deals with that could have flown into that chapter, and whether he thinks that would be a good solution or not, to see Jesus as this symbolic living stream that cleanses. I think the one interesting thing is that he separates clearly between moral impurity and ritual impurity, but at the end he argues that Jesus is both, the cleansing of ritual impurity and moral impurity. And that's, of course, what the cross is all about, that Jesus removes sin altogether. So those are some of the places where this book could have, more directions that this book could have gone through. But in general, I find this a very appealing concept, and those of you that have read my dissertation will find that I've argued in a different way some other arguments. There are some chapters that weren't as strong. I'm not quite sure about the Sabbath chapter. I think he falls into the critique that he critiques others with. There's better ways of solving it, and I've written on that myself. So that's why I was very interested to see his argument. There might be better ways of solving that, but in general, he makes a very convincing and important case for ritual purity. Any on this line, I prepared you any comments on this that you want to add, any evaluation or critique. Okay, that means I think I've given everybody the time that if they want to, they can contribute. Again, a really, really important book. Now, maybe a final question. Is there one concept or maybe a concept that you thought this was the key and you loved it the most, or maybe a quotation that you thought was particularly impressive that you want to share with the group? So we come to our final point here. What is a memorable quote or one key concept that you've appreciated? This is kind of a 30-second or 1-minute question that you can share and highlight. I'll open up the floor. Share with us.
One concept that I appreciate is placing the gospel within its context, its historical context.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Yes, excellent.
Yeah, one of the concepts also that I like the most, it's actually in the introduction, in which he gives an idea that most of the time when we are using some modern terminologies, we might go away from what the true meaning of those words means. And he gives the example of profanity, holy, pure, impure. And that really catches me a lot, because most of the time we use modern terminologies and we apply them to the Bible while they are not somehow correlated.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for sharing that concept. Okay, anybody else? Okay, then I'll share. I'll share, since I've already talked about the large concept, one small thing that I really appreciate. I already shared my favorite quote, which is actually the final paragraph in which he kind of summarizes this. I've already shared with you the main idea that I loved, which is that he puts it into this prophetic line, Jesus as an extension of the prophetic line of the Old Testament, not the priestly line, and how Jesus is this prophet that exceeds Moses and Elisha. I find that to be a very helpful way of looking at it, and a very intertextual approach. There is one aspect that I appreciate, and that it was new insight, even though I studied this passage a lot, some new insight based on his study on the contrast between the woman with the blood flow and the Jairus's daughter. And how both of them receive life back. And the concept is he connects this flow of blood with childbirth, or the lack thereof. So the woman that has a flow of blood in Mark chapter 5, she can't have children. Her womb is dead. And that's why she is impure. It's a force of death that produces the force of impurity. That's this negative concept. And this negative force. So she is dead, her womb is dead, but Jesus healing her and removing that impurity from her gives her the ability to have children again and gives her life. And so that is a new parallel between these two stories. There's many parallels. There's an entire dissertation written on the parallels between this. It's a sandwich story and intercalation. It has many, many aspects, but that is something that I even haven't seen in aspects of, in entire dissertations written just on this passage. This aspect of the womb being dead by this flow of blood and it being restored to life, and life being able to come out of that. Now, we never hear whether that woman actually will or has given birth in the rest of the story, and we will never find out, at least not in this part of the world, maybe in the heaven to come. But that is an interesting concept, and he parallels that to all kinds of ancient sayings about the dead womb. If you have a discharge, then your womb is dead. And he finds sources that support this perspective from that period of time, the 1st century and Second Temple period. So I found that an interesting parallel in which Jesus, in 2 accounts, so why these 2 stories? Why is it so important? The only thing she couldn't do was go into the temple. Everything else was normal for her. Well, she is restored into the community into full membership. She can attend the church setting and the temple setting again. That is one aspect, but even more so, she's restored back to life and she can give life. And so that I thought was a brilliant analysis and exposition. I think one aspect that is really important to remember in all of this, especially in the story of the woman, is that in the New Testament, we don't have whatever understanding of that we move forward with. The temple ceases to exist. And so the most severe limitation was not that you were ostracized necessarily, or that you were sent out into the desert, that you weren't allowed to come in contact with everybody. No, you could actually come in contact with people, as he argues with the woman, and there is no sin to it even. This being banished to the outside is probably overstated by modern authors. The worst concept was that people couldn't attend the temple. The temple was holy. Now, the interesting concept, as we continue to study this in the New Testament, is that the temple ceases to exist, as we've talked about before, and the holy space transfers from a physical location, the temple on the Temple Mount, Mount Zion, and various references to it, to Paul talks about the temple as the Holy Spirit. In the New Testament community, it's now the individual, and it's not a communal setting or the church or a building anymore. It is the person itself. And so that forward is going to be an interesting thing to continue to study. Again, Thiessen doesn't deal with anything beyond the Gospels. So that would be an interesting concept to see how the New Testament continues to develop these ideas and what implication it has for how we deal with that today. So more to be written, more to be studied. Maybe Thiessen is going to put out another volume, or maybe one of you is going to tackle the challenge of the Pauline writings or Acts and impurity. Thank you so much for sharing. I hope this was an enlightening book. The summary that I can give is that this is an incredibly valuable book that takes a completely new perspective and challenges established thought, and does so succinctly and does so profoundly, and challenges mainstream thought, and challenges even thoughts within our community, though we have some aspects that we highlight already. As a community, there's much more to learn from this book. So highly recommended for a large, wide audience, for scholars in the field, which he challenges, but also for lay members interested in these topics, because it is a readable book of an incredible achievement to write a book that can have such a range of an audience. This is a must-read and a must-have in your shelf if you want to deal and read about Jesus, the 1st century world for sure, but even more than that, and issues of law and purity. So thank you all for joining me and for sharing this interesting book discussion. I look forward to seeing you at our next meeting, which is with Dr. Gordon Beetz in 1 month time. Thank you again for joining us. Let's close with a word of prayer as we conclude our discussion today. Dear Lord, I want to thank you for this time to reflect on research, to read and deliberate, to share thoughts. Most of all, as a result of this reading, we realize the complexity, both of the law that Moses penned onto pages in the ancient world, but also how the forces of death have been overcome in the life and ministry and death of Jesus. And we want to thank you for Jesus and for his work. And this force of holiness that makes it something that we want to attain to, that solves our issues, though maybe purity is not the most readily cognizant to us anymore. We do realize in reading and studying this, Jesus showed us that forces of holiness are stronger than the forces of death. And in that knowledge and understanding, we go and face the reality of life around us, which is still full of death and suffering and pain, recognizing that Jesus has conquered already. Thank you that we can be a part of that community and be followers of this Jesus. Be with us as we leave and meet again in our next meeting. In your name, amen.
Do you want to sharpen your leadership skills in teaching, preaching, discipleship, evangelism, worship, and other ministerial or pastoral functions?
Do you want to advance your techniques and approach in doing practical theological research?
Do you desire to grow in your understanding of biblical, theological, and secular theories in order to integrate this into an effective, relevant, ministerial and mission practices?
Do you want a deeper commitment to Christian service, ministry, and mission?
Then the Doctor of Ministry degree program at AIIAS is for you.
The Doctor of Ministry program at AIIAS is designed for experienced pastors, mission executives, church leaders, and other ministry professionals. The main goal of this degree program is to equip the person with a higher level of ability in the practice of church leadership and ministry. This is achieved through a curriculum which renews the personal life of faith, sharpens ministerial skills, stimulates growth and understanding of the biblical, theological, theoretical foundations of ministry and mission. A Doctor of Ministry project or dissertation is required for this degree to give evidence of the student's ability to do research and to demonstrate the student's expertise and knowledge of the issues addressed in his chosen topic.
As a student in the Doctor of Ministry program, I would say that it's fun, exciting, and at the same time challenging. Challenging because there are so many concepts, so many things that you need to learn. It's fun and exciting because you get to apply it in real life. You get to practice it and share it to the people, especially to your members.
The program has been an enriching experience for me. It has put the passion deep within me to reach the unreached in the 1040 window.
The program of the Doctorate in Ministry program has been able to enrich me to fulfill my big purpose in which I was created for, to give me the education and the experience needed to go forth from here to do what I was called to be.
The program has deepened my spiritual experience. It has broadened my understanding about ministry. It has also ignited my passion to serve. I have been more equipped than I was before coming to AIIAS.
The program has been an enriching experience for me. It has put the passion to reach the unreached in the 1040 window with the everlasting gospel.
The program in itself, I would say, it's a complete package. It provides all the necessary things that you need to learn in order to be an effective minister for God.
In the program, we have committed professors who are willing to train students with their rich pastoral, administrative experience and scholarly work.
Come, enroll. Visit our websites for inquiry. Blessings, Maranatha.